Our chronicles bring us back in time to several decades ago, as a matter of fact, because there is one subject that we have to go back to if only we can recognize what has been done in the past and what could still be done in the future should any eventuality occur again. And this refers to my island of Mindanao, which has been an island of conflict and an island which has been taken care of in many ways, but there is still the need to understand what exactly has been happening in that part of our country. Our chronicles bring us back to the time when the conflict between what they call the Muslims and the Christians occurred. Because if we have to talk about our diplomatic missions to be able to settle the conflict in the South and to be able to find peace for our people, both the Christians, the Muslims, the indigenous tribes, and several other entities, then we really have to go back in time. And so our chronicles bring us back to when this all began. They say that there are errors in our history, and oftentimes these errors in history can no longer be corrected. For instance, how did it happen that we have a concentration of the Islam religion only in the South, when actually we have traces of mythological or legendary or even historical records as far as Pangasinan, for instance, in Lingayen, you have there Princess Urduja, who established her kingdom in that part of our country. So what happened during that time? Why did she recede somewhere all the way up to central Luzon and then she disappeared? And then also let us talk about Manila itself, where you had Raja Sulaiman, the kingdom, the sultanate of Sulaiman here by the Pasig River. It was a flourishing kind of a kingdom, and that is why part of it actually is legend or story. But they say that when he learned that the Spaniards were already in Cebu, they've landed and they were coming up to Manila, he burned the entire city of Manila where his kingdom was located, so that the invaders, as he would call them, would not benefit from whatever it was that they had. And that was what happened as far as Manila was concerned. It was an Islamic state in a way, in many ways, as a matter of fact. And then there were other datus. You had Sumakwel, and then you have the Datu Humabon, for instance, and all of this. So practically our entire country was Islamized in a way long before the Spaniards, because of the currents coming from the Pacific Ocean, had them land Magellan in Mactan, in Cebu, and that was the colonization of our country in sometime 1521, as a matter of fact. So, but long before that, perhaps a century even, we already have this datus and the sultanates all over our country. Be that as it may, we now consider the areas in Mindanao, some provinces that have a wide population of Muslims. And time again, we have tried to understand exactly why in these locations there has been conflict and so forth. But the conflict came perhaps because of the understanding in language or in territory. As far as Islam is concerned, land is something which is God-given in a way. And so when they settled in several of the provinces in Mindanao, their territories were as far as the eye could see. Now, when the people from Luzon and Visayas wanted to settle down south, that was when they had the homestead, for instance, then they started to partition the land. And they had to title this. They had to title this with what, during the American time, they called it the Torrens title, so that you could write in that specific real estate property how far and how large your land is, actually. So that was how it was. And then it could not be understood by the natives there, which are the Muslims, why there is a titling that they have done on the land. But nonetheless, there was no conflict as yet. When did this conflict begin? Well, if I go by my chronicles, as far as my history is concerned, sometime in 1964, 65, that was when this first stirrings of a discontent and the possibility that some groups wanted to, leave the Republic of the Philippines, leave in the sense that they wanted to be independent of the central government, as they call it in Manila. As a matter of fact, the central government in Manila was called Gobierno Sarawang-Tao. It's a government of a foreign people. So this began with a librarian Hashim Salamat, who was sent to the Middle East to study the Quran and further studies on the theology of Islam. He was exposed to the Palestinian liberation movement, where Palestine was already fighting the Jews as far as Israel was concerned, because time has brought this another error in history. Palestine was Palestine, and you had there living the Palestinian Arabs and the Palestinians, who were recognized all the way from biblical times. And then we had the Second World War, and all of a sudden, yes, in 2 years after the United Nations organization was organized, precisely to be able to have peace throughout the world, they decided that Palestine would now be the land of Israel. And so in 1948, you had several countries of the United Nations signing that international declaration that Palestine is now Israel, and the Jews could now settle there. So what happened was the Palestinians, of course, were completely caught unaware of this kind of a historical happening as far as their land is concerned and as far as their territory is concerned. But be that as it may, that is history. And so, as we said, we go back to Hashim Salamat, who was studying in Egypt, but got exposed to the Palestinian movement to be able to have a partitioning of Israel as really part of Palestine. So that began there, and he probably thought that, well, since we also are part of Mindanao, then perhaps you could do something of the sort, granting also our independence from the rest of the Philippines. So that was how it all began. But there were political maneuverings that also got into play, because at the time, most of the leaders, or the political leaders that we had in Mindanao, the Muslims, particularly in the provinces of Cotabato and Lanao. Remember, Cotabato was still an undivided province. It was the largest province in the Philippines, and that was at that time. And now we have 5 provinces of Cotabato, but that was how large it was. As I've said, the largest province in the Philippines. And then you had Lanao. There was still no partition of Lanao Sur or Lanao Norte. It was just the province of Lanao. So be that as it may, these 2 big provinces were the predominant population were the Muslims, and with the influence coming from the teachings of Hashim Salamat, because he became an imam after his graduate studies in the University of Egypt, then he started to talk about the possibility of having independence from the rest of the island, from the rest of the Philippine Republic, precisely the way the Palestinians were moving into Israel in a manner that they wanted also to secede or to remove a portion of Israel or of Palestine as belonging to the Palestinians. So that was the great influence that happened. Why do I know this? Because Hashim Salawat was a personal friend. Much later, after all of the movements were happening, he became a personal friend. And so the story of how he got influenced and how he started the crusade to have an independent movement was his personal story to me directly. So anyway, that was way, way back in 1965 as we go back to the time. And so by the efforts undertaken by Hashim Salamat, he was supported strongly by a number of Islamic countries throughout the world, because there is this strong bonding as far as the religion is concerned. And so that is where the logistical support and the moral and spiritual support coming from the Islamic countries abroad were pouring into Mindanao. And our armed forces were having a difficult time combating the upsurge that occurred there, in the sense that they were heavily armed because of the ammunition that they were receiving. And one of the countries that was strongly, directly supporting the independence movement was Libya, under Colonel Gaddafi. There is an Islamic conference that has been organized early on, but some members of this Islamic conference also participated in the support, but this is purely moral and spiritual as far as the independence movement that was being launched in Mindanao at the time. This was 1965, and it was coupled by the fact that, as I've said, the political leaders in these major provinces belonged to a different political party from the national administration, which was President Marcos at the time, who was a nacionalista. And then you had the leaders or the politicians of both Lanao provinces and Cotabato province as liberal So there was a conflict in the political arena as far as that's concerned. In other words, should we say that during the time of the Liberal Party, when Diosdado Macapagal was the president, well, you had Udtog Matalam, and then you had Senator Salipada Pentaton and Cotabato, and they were both liberals. And then in Lanao, you had the Alontos, and then you had the Lukmans. So that's exactly what happened at the time. I will continue this chronicle, just giving you a background of the situation that was then at that time.